By now, the whole news-watching world will know that Australia had a referendum to amend our constitution to recognise the continent's Indigenous peoples, and voted no. A lot of my overseas friends are going to be wondering what the hell is going on here. So let me explain. Australia was a handful of small, far-flung, self-governing British colonies right up until 1901, when the colonies federated and became states in the Commonwealth of Australia. The constitution they enacted is an unexciting legal document that doesn't include a Bill of Rights and doesn't mention the continent-wide complex society of hundreds of clans and language groups displaced by colonial settlement and dispossessed by this very document, except briefly as a problem of governance, a subject minority to be dealt with by the states at their discretion. You can perhaps imagine the atrocities that led to. Australia is dominated by what one of our historians called the tyranny of distance, meaning the fact that we are a British outpost on a continent unimaginably remote from Britain when it was colonised, where British culture took a lot of brutally hard adapting before it could function successfully in the very alien climate and environment. The anxieties of the colonial era, the isolation, the hardship, the profound alienation, the cruelty and grotesque inequities of imperial process, the chronic horror of whippings and chain gangs and race wars and starvation, and drunken, corrupt military police and remote, uncaring overlords. All these things are written deep in the DNA of white Australia. And deepest of all, down where most of us still refuse to look, is how much murdering we had to do. Between massacres, border wars and smallpox, this continent's Indigenous population fell from an estimated 1 to 1.5 million before the 1788 British invasion to around 100,000 by the early 1900s. When right-wing Australians deny the Aboriginality of light-skinned Indigenous people, it's this genocide they want to discount, and the survival of Aboriginal identity, culture and clan networks. This referendum has shown us that a disturbing number of Australians still think like British imperialists. They know nothing about Indigenous culture except that it's beneath their notice, and they think Aboriginal people should assimilate into modern Australia, starting at the bottom without their land, of course, or die out. You'll always have your hardcore crazies, though. Most Australians are proud to share this continent with its original inhabitants and respectful of their achievements. Well, the relatively few they know about. But even with that limited understanding, this referendum had 65% public support before the No campaign launched a disinformation blitz that eventually reversed the vote. Because while people on the political left have gone on listening and learning and building relationships with the Indigenous community, people on the right have become increasingly defensive, accusatory, and deceptive in their language. And the disengaged majority in the middle, who eventually voted no, that was the vast numbers of outer suburban migrant communities and predominantly Anglo-rural communities who mostly can't afford to pay much attention to the world beyond their immediate interests, know nothing about the structure of Indigenous society at the time of invasion, and don't really trust governments. And still we had 65% approval for the change in the beginning. I'm not going to start dissecting the Labor government's role in this shameful debacle, because political analysts from both sides are all over that. But the Prime Minister was clearly played by the opposition leader. More on that villain in a minute, because there's a whole chain of responsibility in this shit fight. Just a quick recap, in case you aren't Australian and haven't seen my other videos on this topic. A historic Indigenous conference in 2017 had asked that the long overdue constitutional recognition of Indigenous occupation involve not merely an acknowledgement, but the enshrining of an advisory body elected by Indigenous people to ensure better drafting of laws directly affecting Indigenous people, since the history of such advisory bodies existing only in legislature was of government disregard and interference. All the elders were really asking was that their advisory council to government, which is in no way a third chamber, it's more like a minor peak body, that it be structured and selected by Indigenous people and not be subject to dissolution at government whim. It was to be the first stage in a process of truth-telling and makarata, or reconciliation, that would eventually lead to treaty. The proposed amendment, which should have sailed through on a bipartisan campaign, failed because the federal opposition opposed it, granting legitimacy and momentum to a blatant disinformation campaign that spawned mass confusion across the media, especially in the regions, spreading numerous increasingly absurd fears about what the change might really entail. Those who voted no believe it was because the proposed model was flawed or undesirable, but in truth, if the referendum had simply been for an honourable mention of Indigenous people in the Constitution, it still would have failed without bipartisan support. And the current opposition admitted to at least one journalist that its reasons for opposing the change were not those it put forward to the public, but purely a strategic game against Labor. But to see how it could come to this, we need to backtrack. Firstly, we have generations of politically disengaged voters who don't understand much about political process because, like the rest of the developed world, we've had decades of promotion of the principle of self-interest without adequately engaging civics education. So most people think all they have to worry about is themselves and their own kind. Most Australians accept diversity in principle, grudgingly or gladly, but they mostly keep to their own circles, they aren't media literate, and tough times make them jealous of limited resources. Secondly, we have a media environment distorted by big corporations to favour right-wing causes and big power, often even when it doesn't mean to and doesn't realise it's doing so. Imagine, just 50 years after Federation, a young Rupert Murdoch, poised to take over his father's newspaper and turn it into a global empire. Murdoch was already meddling in Australia's politics and dictating our media laws in the 1970s, and as a result, our entire national conversation has long been distorted, hobbled by disinformation, and dragged to the right. Then we have the rise of right-wing extremism, which is essentially the patriarchy defending itself against the logical conclusions of the Enlightenment. And we have the rise of hardman demagogues, skilled in strategic disinformation and aided by the internet's decentralisation of authority and truth. And then, like a shiny beige cherry on top, we have Peter Dutton, the Conservative opposition leader, widely but not fondly known as Spud the Potato, or Mr. Potato Head, in whom all the aforementioned phenomena combine. Look, I've gone on long enough here for TikTok. I might do a longer version for my Patreon members, but it comes down to this. Australia has failed the Indigenous people of this continent overall consistently since colonisation, and it just voted to keep failing them. Worse, most of the nation evidently has no idea what just happened. We voted not to give Indigenous people a voice to Parliament, not because the model was flawed, but because we're still not ready to hear their voice. Because we're not quite as stupid as we seem, and deep down we have an inkling that if we listen, really listen, to Indigenous Australia, we will have to acknowledge that not only did we commit atrocities against a people and all but destroy a venerable culture loaded with solutions to modern crises, but our proud modern nation is already destroying the fragile ecosystem on which all this is built, and the empire will be forced to evolve into something its loyal citizens are not yet ready to contemplate. I encourage you, whoever and wherever you are, to send Indigenous Australians some love right now, because they are hurting and solidarity surely helps. Check my bookmarks and follows, or search hashtags like Aboriginal, Yes23 or Voice Referendum. If this defeat is to mean anything, we must not let it be glossed over like the rest of our history. We must use it to demand real reckoning with modern Australia's relationship to this continent's First Peoples, their history, their culture, and their knowledge. We have lost so much already.